Windows Tools and Diagnostics, Part 2. In this nugget, we take a look at Windows Tools and Diagnostics. This is Part 2. We'll start off by talking about the MMC console. This is kind of a unified interface that we can use and customize, and it's also fairly intuitive. And we also take a look here at Task Manager, which is a great way to get real-time information about what's going on in the system and to manage applications and services that are running. We take a look also at Regedit, which is a tool that you can use to customize or configure Windows, and it's a very detailed and high-level tool that you can use, so you don't treat it casually. I'll talk to you more about that. And then we look at regional settings as well. Maybe you have someone that wants to look at their clock-in military time, for example. Well, you can change that in the regional settings, or if you want to change the language, for example. We look at indexing as well, which is a way to make things more easily and quickly searchable on your system. And then we'll conclude here by looking at remote desktop, which is a great way to be productive, and remote assistance, which is a great way for your users to ask for help from the help desk. A few years back, my wife bought me this really nice circular saw for Christmas. It was battery powered, and it had a little laser on it so you could cut these perfectly straight lines, provided you were also coordinated enough to follow the line. Anyway, I took the circular saw out to the garage and found a few pieces of wood. I found some 2x4s that desperately needed cutting in half. And then I decided they needed to be cut in quarters. And then I cut them again. So anyway, I cut them into little tiny pieces. Not sure what I'm going to do with all those little tiny pieces. Then I found some plywood, and I cut that into several different pieces as well because they were just way too big. So I cut them. You ever get a tool or some kind of a device or something that you thought, boy, this is something I really need, and then it turns out, gee, you don't really use it for that much at all after all? Well, that's not really the case at all with some of the Windows tools that I'm going to show you here today, because we have a lot of things here that we're going to be probably using as administrators on a maybe a daily basis, but probably very often on a weekly basis. And one of those tools that you'll find that you use probably every day will be some version of the Microsoft Management Console. What this gives us is a standardized interface as compared to old NT4 tools, which would have a different kind of an interface involving different dialog boxes and different layouts for all the tools that we had in NT4. Now, starting with Windows 2000, we'll use the Microsoft Management Console instead, or better known as the MMC. What this uses is a blank MMC if you start from scratch, and then you put in various snap-ins into it. And using those snap-ins, you can then gain access to various administrative functions. And of course, most of them require administrative rights because they're some kind of a system change or some kind of a configuration change. And of course, you're going to need to be an administrator for most of those things. Now, on the client operating systems, most everything you're going to need is probably going to already be found in Computer Management Console. And so if we just go ahead and go to a command prompt here, let's go to this right here. If we go to a command prompt, I'll just type MMC. Then notice that it first of all prompts me to give administrative permission, so I'll click on Continue. And then once that opens up, then we can add in various snap-ins. Now, if I went to File and then Add Remove Snap-in, then I could locate, for example, Computer Management, and there it is right there. All right, so I just double-click to add that in. I can connect it to this computer or some other one. I'll choose this one, and then just OK. Now, this gives me the Computer Management Snap-in with all the same things that we've seen in previous nuggets, because we've looked at this a few times already. An alternative way to get to the same interface, by the way, would be if I would just type compmgmt.msc. That would also have then popped open the Computer Management Console. Now, while we're here, let me give you the kind of the lay of the land. Over on the left-hand side, we have the specific category of item that you want to administer, whether it's something in tasks, an event viewer item, device manager, or whatever. In the middle is where you usually have the specific item that you're trying to deal with. So, for example, if I wanted to update this driver, I might right-click here and update the driver. Right? And then over on the right-hand side, I very often will just get rid of all this stuff, because a lot of the actions and things that it shows you over here are the same things that you would get from a right-click anyway on one of these things, for example. Or if I were to right-click here, see, View, and then over here, the only other actions, View, same thing. So very often I'll just click this item up here at the top, which will hide the action pane. Only because it gives me more real estate, and if I need to expand things out a little bit better, it might be a little bit easier to read. Now then, we also have a few other kinds of consoles, though, and there's a bunch of different ones. There's probably some number of maybe a dozen or so, but I want to show you the more common ones that you're likely to see. Again, just about all of these are already included in computer management, but for A+ exam objective purposes, you might need to know the names of these and specifically how to launch them. So, for example, another one would be services.msc. Okay, oops, it's supposed to be plural. Sorry about that. Services, plural.mmc, and of course that takes us to services, which again we already have in Computer Management Console. Now, if you have some interfaces, if you select the item, then it may show you some kinds of help over here in the middle portion of this. For example, if you work with domains, you'll have group policies, and they will very often show a description of the group policies over there. It's very useful because sometimes they're a little bit baffling, and there are thousands of policies, so that description can be useful. There's also WF.MSC, and this simply stands for the Windows Firewall. Let me close this up. WF.MSC, and Windows Firewall will pop open here then, and I can then configure this so that I, create some kind of new rule or allow an inbound rule so that someone can communicate with my machine using a specific service, for example. We don't really talk about Windows Firewall in this particular nugget, but we'll talk more about firewalls and some of those things a little bit later on. Okay. Then we also have things such as disk management, again, already part of computer management, but if I just typed in diskmgmt.msc, disk management, and click on continue, then we'll see that we again also get the conventional disk management interface that we've seen a number of other times in previous nuggets here as well. Okay. And then finally, we would have device manager. This would be just DEV MGMT. Notice that anything that has the word management in it is just MGMT. So if you need to feel any need to memorize any of that for exam purposes, perhaps that little tip there would help you. Let me close this up so I can continue on. And so we would have disk MGMT. Oh, I just did that one, didn't I? Device management DEV MGMT.MSC. And then, of course, we'd have Device Manager. So all of these things are fairly intuitive in terms of the layout, the way they work, and so forth, but these are the most common ones that you're likely to see. Now, I do want to show you one other thing here as well. I don't think it's going to be on the exam particularly, but as a matter of practical administration, what I recommend that you do is if you don't find everything you need in computer management, or if maybe computer management's a little too cluttered for you and you want to customize that, you can't really customize computer management directly, but I could create a blank MMC console here, and then when I add various items in here, I simply click here to File, Add, Remove, Snap In, and maybe I want to work with certificates. I have certificates for my user account that I want to look at, certificates for my computer account. If you're not familiar with certificates, they're useful for things like token-based authentication. So it's useful for things like smart cards, for example, or you can use it to sign emails or do certain kinds of encryption and things like this. Very high level of security involved in that. Maybe I work with Device Manager a lot. Well, add that in there as well. Maybe I want to look at Event Viewer every day to see if we've got any glaring problems going on. So you see, there's a few things there. If this is all I ever really work with, and I don't really care about any of the rest of those things, including what's included in computer management, now I've just created my own custom console that looks exactly the way I want it to look. And what I can do with this then is I can just go into this. If I have certain kinds of certificates or anything, if I have a view that I want to park on every day when I open it up, then I can do that. Actually, this is probably more likely in terms of reality, so let me go down here to Windows Logs. Maybe I always want to see if there's any system log problems, okay? So what I would do now is I would save this so it's in an easy place to access every day when I come into the office, and then I'll just be able to open that up. So I'll just call this, James Console. Okay, James Console. Notice that it puts it by default on Administrative Tools, but normally I'll also put that on the a shortcut to that on my desktop. And then the other thing to keep in mind with this is Options. See, what will happen here is if I make changes to this, so I click on something else and something else is focused on, when I close this console, it's going to ask me if I want to save those changes every time if I stay in author mode. If I change it to user mode full access, however, and I say do not save changes to this console and click OK, now when I save it and close it, then when I open it up the next time and make changes, it's not going to nag me about that anymore. So where is my console here? Oh, also another thing to keep in mind is that the administrative tools that we see right over here on the right, this is the all users administrative tools, but the console I just created is for my own individual profile, so that will only appear here under administrative tools here, and then there it is, James Console. And again, I just right click and drag that out to the desktop, so I always have easy access to that kind of thing. And then as an administrator, again, I can launch that open, and I can change the focus of this if I want to something else. And now, once I've changed it to user mode full access, then it will no longer nag me about saving this every time after I close it. So there I close it, and there it goes. Okay, so that's the MMC console, highly customizable, overall pretty intuitive, and a really good tool and a really good change that Microsoft made starting with Windows 2000 up to the current operating systems. Now, the other tool that you're going to use quite frequently, really, is going to be Task Manager. I really like this tool because although there's certainly more elaborate tools or more esoteric tools out there that provide more detail, there's probably no tool I use more frequently than Task Manager in terms of daily administration and checking out what kind of resources the system is using and so forth. This provides a real-time view, and that, in other words, there's no way to save the information that you see in here or to log that information. It's just current time view or real-time view of it, and it shows you all of the applications and processes that are currently going on, of various services that are running, how the system is performing and what kind of resources it currently requires, the network bandwidth throughput that's currently in use, as well as any users that are logged onto the system, either locally or remotely through something like a remote desktop. Now, first of all, I'm going to show you how to launch it, and then I'm going to show you all of those tabs. A couple of different ways to launch it, several different ways actually. One of those ways would be to simply press Control-Alt-Delete, and once you've done that, you can notice that down here it says Start Task Manager. So you could launch it that way, and here it appears. Another way you could do this is to right-click on the desktop and choose Task Manager. And then my most common way of doing this is Control-Shift-Escape. And there it appears. Okay, that's probably the quickest and easiest way to get to Task Manager. Now, I don't really have anything running right now, so I'm just going to launch anything, just this console that I created, for example. And once I launch this, we'll see that it now appears in the running applications. Also notice that it's always on top. Even when I click the focus on this console in the background, this is still going to stay on top. So what you can do with this is you can change the options so that it's not always on top. And so you can also hide it when it's minimized. So for right now, if I minimize it, it still appears on the taskbar, but I can also minimize it, or rather, hide it when it is minimized. Too many clicks there, okay? Hide it when it is minimized, and then it will appear in the tray area. Notice it gives this little green grid looking thing right here. So it gives me a little bit more of what's going on there. It gives me a good snapshot view of the applications that are currently running. If I'm having troubles with one of these applications, maybe that one's hung or something like that, and I can't seem to close it. You've seen that where you click the X in the upper right, and it just starts to say not responding or some other kind of frustration there. What you can do is you can right-click on it and simply choose End Task. And most of the time, especially with simple applications, it should just close that app. Some more complicated applications have a little problem with that, however, especially if there's a lot of goings-on inside of that application that have kind of independent interdependencies, if that's a good way to say it. A good example of that would be VMware. You see, I could try to close VMware right now if it appeared right here in my list of tasks, but there's several other operating systems running inside of VMware. And so because of that, sometimes it's very difficult to close down applications like that. And just as a practical note, I've often found that if it's not closing down properly and it seems to not be responding, with very disk-intensive apps like VMware, sometimes you just have to sit there and stare at it for maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes. Go get a cup of coffee and come back. Some of those types of applications will eventually start to respond. It just depends upon how busy the how busy the operating systems are that are being run in those types of apps like VMware. So anyway, that's one of the things that I could do with this. Let me just launch something else for the sake of variety here. Let me open up, how about, I thought something would be quickly accessible here. Let's just go to Notepad. Simple enough. And then as I go to this item, I can also change the priority. Notice that I can right-click on this and then go to its process. Also, there's create dump file. That's useful for analyzing problems with applications that appear to be crashing. Developers will be able to take a look at that dump file and see if there's anything that was causing conflicts or other problems with it. But anyway, I would go to the process, which notice takes me right to the processes tab. Now, what's useful about this is that many applications will have dozens of little things running in processes. For example, I'm going to bring over here my Windows 7 Task Manager. Okay, just so you can see it over here. That's Windows 7 Task Manager. Look at all the different things I've got going on. I got several instances of Google Chrome going on with multiple tabs open. I've got lots of different little apps going on all at the same time right now. Okay, so the reason why going to an app, right-clicking on it, and choosing Go to Process is an advantage is because it's not always a small list like this, and it's not always obvious what the application is. Well, this will help me get right to where I need to go. And then once I've gotten here, a number of things I can do with this as well. Number one, I can see who's running it. Now, if it doesn't have a name next to it, that's going to be the system itself that's running that. Then there's also the CPU utilization, and if I'm having troubles with CPU utilization and something seems to be hogging it, then I can click the CPU column, and whatever's using the most CPU cycles will float right to the top. Okay, so that's another way you can look at this. And then there's also memory. If I want to see what's using the most memory in the system, I can click this column, and it again shows me what's using the most right at the top. Now, things like Explorer and Task Manager, not much I can do about those. But I might have forgotten that I left, Photoshop open, and it has a 900 megabyte panorama open, and that's going to be possibly using a lot of memory. Well, then I know right away that if I close that, I'm going to probably improve my performance. I can also show processes from all users, which will show me the local as well as the system accounts there, and I'll show you what I mean here in a moment. See, there's the local service and system, and that's not an awful lot that I do with that. It's just that they will show up. It's probably more useful if you have multiple users logging on using fast user switching. This is where I might be logged on currently, and maybe I've got several applications open and documents open, and someone else comes up and says, hey, I need to log on for a little while. So I'll say, fine. Instead of having to log off and save everything, I probably should save it anyway, but instead of having to log off and then start all over again by logging on again later in the day, instead I can keep all that stuff open, let the other person log on, and then we'll have 2 or more people logged on at once. It's just that only one person can access the desktop at a time. Of course, the risk there is if the second person that logs on does something risky or they cause the system to crash, then I've lost all of my data and I've lost all of the applications that I had open. So again, hopefully, you should still save stuff before you switch over to someone else anyway. Another thing I could do with this is maybe I've got some questions about Notepad. Maybe I've never heard of it and I say, what in the world is that thing? Where did it come from? Well, I could open the file location and see if it looks like it's in a familiar location. Otherwise, if it's not, maybe it's some kind of malware or a virus or something like that. The other thing I could do is I could just end the process. This would be the case if it just stops responding for whatever reason. And I've kind of given up patience. Then I could end that process and possibly start over again and see if I can get a better start next time. The other thing I could do would be end process tree. Now that'll probably have very little, if any, effect on Notepad, but there's some applications where you'll have other applications that are currently running as well that have common dependencies on the same services or files. See, so end process tree not only closes the application, but anything else that application was depending upon that it was branching out from. That's why they call it a tree. So an example of that would be Microsoft Office. If I'm running Word, PowerPoint, and Outlook, and I end process tree on PowerPoint, then it could affect Outlook and Microsoft Word as well, and potentially close those applications if they're dependent upon those files in the tree as well. There's also this item right here, and if I right-click on this, you'll see virtualization. What in the world is that about? People commonly mistake that to mean something to do with VMware or Hyper-V or Microsoft Virtual PC. That doesn't have anything to do with that type of virtualization. What it relates to is redirects. You see, a lot of times there might be applications that attempt to write to various locations in protected file systems, such as in program files, and they will try to do this under just the user's logon credentials. And if they're not an administrator, they have no right to write to program files. This is something that older applications used to do quite a lot, where if you open an app and maybe it made configuration changes in it, it would write to program files. This means then that other users that also log on would see those same changes. And then it could be a ping-pong match where one user turns on a setting, another user turns off the setting, and the next time they use the computer, it's kind of a mess. Well, what virtualization does, and it's already pretty automatic within Windows, current versions of Windows, is it will redirect that to where the application thinks it's going to program files, but the operating system fools it into actually going to the virtual store, which I've already opened up for you here. And you can see here that I'm in the user, in the users, trainer, app data, local, and then virtual store. And then here's locations where various applications think that they're writing to the literal program files. In reality, they're writing into my profile to avoid system overwrites and other things that could cause, some consternation or problems here. You can also create a dump file. In order to use the dump file, though, you have to download another application from Microsoft that is specifically designed to open dump files, and it looks at all the memory addresses and all the applications that we're running and stuff like that, mostly for developers and people that are troubleshooting applications on a very high level. Now, this is something that you sometimes might have a need for. You can set the priority. By default, applications will start at the normal priority. But if I've got several applications running all at once, and none of the applications is getting very good CPU utilization because they're all having to split up the CPU time slices, then what I could do is, if I have one that's more critical, maybe it's a SQL database that I've got to get some data from, because I've got a client waiting and I've got to get a report made or something, I can increase that to above normal or high. Now, be careful about changing it to real time. And the reason for that is because real-time can sometimes compete with the system processes themselves. It's not as big as an issue now as it used to be in the old days of like NT4, but it could potentially dominate CPU resources and even take them away from the operating system itself. But you could raise the priority here. Now, in this case, I could change it to high and change the priority. This just tells me it might cause system instability, but I could change that priority, and I don't really care. I'm not going to get any better performance out of Notepad now than I was before. Why? Because there's nothing else competing against it. If Notepad wants 100% of the CPU utilization or close to it, it'll probably get it because there's nothing else going on. There's also a few other things that we can do with this. We can go to the set to the affinity. If you have multiple processors in the computer, then I can specify that I want one of these CPUs to be dedicated to this application so that the application does not attempt to also use this CPU. Maybe I have another application or a reason for something else using that one. Don't see the need for that very often on client operating systems. Sometimes for server operating systems, you might need to do that though. Okay. All right, and then we can also go to the properties of this file, and this just takes us the same thing as if we had right-clicked on notepad.exe and chosen its properties, as well as then going to various services here. Now, when I choose Go to Services, it didn't actually take me to anything specific. That just takes me to the Services tab, not really related in any way to Notepad itself. There's not really a whole lot to these services, other than the fact that you can see which ones are running. The rest of it, I think, pretty well explains itself. And then if I click on this actual services item, that just takes me to the services console. This is something that I use pretty frequently. Well, I used to anyway. Now I have gadgets that show me the same thing that are always on the desktop. But this shows me how much CPU utilization is going on right now. I've got 2 processors that are installed here, or actually it's a dual core processor, so I'm good with that. If I double click on the CPU usage, notice that I get a more magnified view that makes it a little bit potentially easier to see. Notice that if I double click on the physical memory usage history, I also get CPU usage history. I don't know why they do that. You would think that they would give us the physical memory usage history magnified, but they don't. Anyway, so that tells me how much physical memory I'm using right now. You can see that it's pretty low, and I have a total of about a gigabyte of RAM going on here. Don't really have a lot going on with it. Now, we also have how much is cached. Cached is not necessarily the same as total free, but this is memory that is reserved and set to the side for quick and easy access. And so by having a large cache here, I'm fine. I'm not really starved for resources at all by using that. And then free is, 8 megabytes that are not accounted for at all that could be used by anything that requested it. Then you can see over here in terms of the system, handles, threads, processes, all of these things relate to how much is being demanded of the processor at this current time. You see, for example, each thread will have a way of connecting to the CPU. So if an application is using one of these threads and it needs attention from the CPU, it'll use one of those threads to kind of jerk the chain, so to speak, of the CPU and say, hey, I need some time here. I need some attention. The uptime and then the size of the page file here as well. And if this isn't enough, by the way, in all these resources that we're looking at on the whole, you can also click the Resource Monitor, which shows us what we saw in a previous nugget. It might have been just the one before this one, in fact, where you can get much more detailed data over what's going on with each one of these resources. Now, for example, one that I like quite a lot is that the disk item. Now, we're not going to see much here, but you'll see that as you start to run more applications, that the hard drive light is going to almost stay constantly on, and it's going to be thrashing quite a lot when it's very, very busy. Well, sometimes I'll want to see what in the world is writing to the hard drive so much, or reading from the hard drive so much. Sometimes it's not a big deal at all. So, for example, if I'm going through a defragmentation run with Diskkeeper 2010, for example, it's going to be a little disk intensive while it's doing that for temporary sacrifice of overall better performance. So I'm okay with that particular one. But it'll show me, how much reading and writing it's doing and so forth. And then if we keep on going here to the networking tab, this tells me how much CPU utilization bandwidth utilization I'm getting out of my adapters. And I like that one too as well for a snapshot because, I want to see if I'm downloading files fast enough or if I seem to be getting good responsiveness from the network and the like. Then there's various users that I can look at over here as well. If I've got somebody else connected, for example, by another remote desktop or logged on locally, whatever. If I have administrative privilege, I can right-click on that user, and then I could disconnect them if they're connected by RDP. We'll talk about that after a while, but this means Remote Desktop Protocol, and as I mentioned earlier in previous nugget, that's actually what I'm using here. Notice I'm actually connected using Remote Desktop Connection. In reality, this computer could be on the other side of the planet, and I could be using RDC connections here to make it look as if it's actually local here. But I could disconnect that person, or I could log that person off either way. So in review, there's all these things that I just talked about in Task Manager. I showed you how to launch Task Manager, and then there's also the priority item where you can raise the priority to like high or real time, or you can also lower it. I didn't really show you that, but you saw in the interface that you could do that as well if you want to. And then I also showed you how to end the processes in Task Manager. Now, there's also a tool here called regedit. This is a tool that, well, it might be a little bit more like the circular saw of tools because you're probably not going to use it every day. Sometimes you're going to need it, and it's going to be very important and critical that you understand it, but it's not an every day or probably even an every week or every month tool that you'll use. Most of the things you can do in regedit, you can also do through the interface much more safely and intuitively than you can with a direct registry edit. Now, this is also the name of the tool that you'll type in. You'll type this in from the run line or the search bar or from a command prompt. If you're using Windows 2000, you can also enter in regedit 32. That's R-E-G-E-D-T, no I there, DT32, and this will just open up a different view of the registry editor, and it'll show you in what we call a Hive view, but most of the time we're not too concerned about that anymore. We just use regedit these days. This will control just about every aspect of the operating system. It can have to do with the user's preferences that they would normally change in control panel, their color schemes, what the size of their mouse pointer, any of those preferential items. Most applications these days will make a number of registry changes when they install. Might even make hundreds or even thousands of registry changes. Be aware of the fact that if you have an application that's poorly written and it makes a bad write to the registry, it can corrupt your entire operating system. Likewise, if you as a human make a human error and you make a bad edit, you can also corrupt the operating system, and you'll have to use other troubleshooting methods to recover from those kinds of mistakes. So this is something that could definitely be something to approach with great caution. You might have to use it, just be very cautious. I also recommend that you do back up the registry editor before you actually use it. And let me give you an example here. I'm just going to crack open the registry editor, typing regedit.exe there. And once I open it up, it'll go to the last place that I was. It has memory, and it remembers the last place that I was whatever this key is here. And it's under HKey local machine, all right? But here's where we'll normally start by default. Now, if I know that I'm going to make a registry change in a specific key, I can go to that key and back it up. Or I could just, go up to, the top of the whatever structure that is that I'm working in, like HKey local machine, and then I could export. Now, it says export. Really, it amounts to pretty much the same as backup. Okay, so I'll call this HKLM for HKey local machine and put this on my desktop. Okay. Now, once it backs that up to the desktop, if I find out that whatever changes I was trying to make here caused some kind of catastrophic problem, and I wish I hadn't have done that, then if I can still access the operating system at all, I can re-import that portion of the registry and hopefully resolve the issue. And then once I've saved it, you can see here that it's out on the desktop. And if I wanted to bring this back in, maybe I'd made a catastrophic change and now I need to make things back the way they were. Double click on it and click continue. And then this prompts me, it says, you got to make sure you trust the source of this, because this could also be a significant security exploit. Hopefully it's just for the purposes of undoing any changes that I'd made. However, if you have a user or somebody that receives an email with a file that ends in .reg, now we have file extensions turned off so I don't see it, but that's actually hklm.reg. Anyway, if they get an reg file in email and someone says, double click on this to make your computer twice as fast, because you double clicked. If you triple clicked, it would have made it 3 times as fast. No, but if they double click and launch that and they have administrative privilege, it more than likely will add some kind of a security exploit or malware or something to that user's computer. So be very careful about just arbitrarily double-clicking on any of these reg files. Now let's talk a little bit also about what each one of these various sections of the registry mean. And starting with the top here at HKey class's root, this identifies what kind of applications will open up different, different items that we have here. And I'm just going to try to kind of arbitrarily, pick something out. I'm just going to kind of find... Oh, here's a good one. BMP. This will be opened by the Microsoft Paint application. Okay, so that's what this is really identifying. When Windows finds a file with a specific extension on it, this identifies which one of the applications that you have installed is going to open it, or which one of the default applications is going to open it as well. And I'm going to skip around here because these are not really listed top to bottom in the order I want to cover them, but let's go right to the bottom here. HKey current config. This is not permanent data that's saved to, to disk, for example, when the system shuts down. This is loaded information that only appears at runtime. And as a result, as A+ technicians, not really anything you do to actually directly edit that. The information that's in there is actually read from elsewhere in the system. In fact, it's actually read from HKey local machine somewhere. Let's also take a look here at HKey local machine. What this relates to is system-wide types of settings specific to this local computer. For example, information about hardware drivers and services and things like that are going to be located here under the system location. We can expand that out to a number of different locations, but that's the kind of information that's stored there. Likewise, as you can tell here, if I install software, it's going to install information about itself in the registry right here, and these would be things that would apply system-wide. If I have anything that's specific to a user, maybe, for example, in Microsoft Word, one user that uses this computer has a customized toolbar that appears. Another user just uses the default toolbar that appears with Microsoft Word. Each one of those will get those settings saved specifically in their own user's location. Now, each user that logs on to the computer will receive a unique SID, and each account has a unique SID, and that's the security identifiers you see here. I really only got a single user account, that's the trainer account, so this is the only thing that we really have going on. But for example, if I were to have some kind of a customized toolbar or anything else customized specifically for an application, it would make a change somewhere in this registry underneath my security identifier. And that's how good applications should be written right now for customization, so that users don't customize something that affects the entire computer at once, just only their own individual portion of the registry. And users do have the right to write to their portion of the registry, usually through some kind of an application. And then here we also have HKey current user. This really is not uniquely its own. It's actually read from this right here. Okay, and this is my user account that's currently logged on underneath that SID. Look at all these items that we see here. Okay, see if this looks familiar. Okay, it's all the same stuff. This is kind of a mirror image of the stuff that we see down here. That's all that really is. And if I needed to make any changes to this, certainly I could. Though, once again, usually you don't directly edit the registry. Hey, there is one thing I wanted to point out here, though. If you have, let's go to the HKey local machine. This also appears under users as well as, like HKey current user, as well as local machine. And if I go down to this and I look at HKey local machine, system, or actually it's not system, it's software. So let me go up to software, Microsoft. I'm kind of just doing this from memory right offhand here. Microsoft Windows, current version. And then if I go down here, notice that there is a run key. Now, why would that be of any importance? Well, I would be sure that you know how to get to this key. It appears under H key current user as well as H key local machine. You can look at my mouse pointer to see the location in both of the same paths from this point forward. Okay, this is important because if you have malware, spyware, viruses or something like that, very often they will add some kind of an executable or something that starts up in the run key, because anything that appears in run will go ahead and launch at the time that I log on if it's under H key current user, or it will start itself up during boot time if it's in this location under H key local machine. So I might need to probe around down here and see if it looks like there's something out of the ordinary that should not be running. Although, if you want to stop it temporarily to see if that's really the cause of a certain problem, you're really much better off to use the msconfig tool we looked at last nugget, or one of the previous nuggets. So if I type msconfig and go to startup, this will show me items that are starting up as a result of registry entries. There's also other ones that start up as a result of being on the start menu, all programs here, for example, and then startup. These things are also going to launch as well. It's the same as if they were in the run key, for example. It's just that the run key is more obscure on purpose, because many of the things that appear there, the vendors or Microsoft themselves might not want the casual user to go in here. If it was in the startup menu, they can just right-click and say, I don't even know what that is, I'm going to delete that. Okay. Well, we might not want that if it's something that's pretty critical to the system. So that's why they might put it in the run key instead. But otherwise, you can use msconfig to deselect the checkboxes there and prevent it from running, at least temporarily. You also should know how to work with the regional settings and the languages. Now, for the languages, something like Windows Vista, you can download different language packs for whatever it is that you're interested in. These can be obtained, for example, from Windows Update. And we'll talk more about Windows Update at a later point in time, but it's just a way to automatically apply security patches, fixes, as well as any optional settings like a language pack that you want to apply to a computer. But what this can do is it can just give you a different language that appears in the interface. Now, if you want to display the language, some other language besides English, in all the menus and dialogues, etc., then you may need to get the multilingual interface pack. You can get that from Microsoft for a number of different languages, most of which I've never even heard of, quite honestly. That some of them seem to be kind of obscure. You also have the ability to change the date format, currency, things of this nature. And probably ought to just show you this and be a little bit easier. Let's get out of the registry here where I was earlier. Let's just go to the control panel here, and you can see that we could go to the clock, language, and region section over here, and you can change, the regional and language options. So here I could choose a different language, for example, like whatever this might be, in Norway or Finland or something like that. So I could change to different languages. Now I would go ahead and do that, but I'm afraid that I wouldn't be able to read my interfaces and then change things back. Anyway, so this is going to display our numbers, currency, dates, and so forth in the language that we see here. So if we would go to, for example, French, then it would change the symbol from $ to francs, and change the time to more of a 24-hour type of a time. It would change our date from a day, month, and then year, whereas in the US, usually it's month and then day and then year. Okay, so and then the long portion of the date would look, something more like this. So this is the kind of thing that we can look at here. You can also customize the format and make more additional customized settings to this as it appeals to you. Okay. Now, in my case, we're also going to take a look at, I need to actually get out of that before I accidentally click OK and mess myself up there. We can also go to the location. This is it's not going to be useful for all instances, but there are certain things, like maybe certain gadgets, which will identify what location you identify. And then, as a result, it will also provide for you maybe news feeds or something like that, based upon the language, or rather the region that you have selected. There's also keyboards. You can change the keyboard layout to something else, again, for a number of different languages, although only US appears here. But if you click on Add, you'll see that there's a number of different other languages, once again, that you can certainly take advantage of. Okay, so we have all of those options as well. Just be aware of where these things are. Normally, you're not going to know which one to pick until you have a user that says, hey, I happen to speak, Serbian. Please choose Serbian input languages for me, or Wolof, or whatever that is. So you can get the idea there. There's also additional settings you can use, such as a language bar, which can be useful in using input that might not otherwise be easy to access from the keyboard, because most keyboards aren't printed with a lot of the other characters, for example, that you might be able to see. And then you can also turn caps lock key off or press the shift key in order to turn caps lock off. This again relates to the fact that some locations see different keys in different locations. So where I have shift, other places might have a caps lock. Okay? And then there's additional administrative changes you can make as well, such as the system locale. And by clicking on this with administrative permission, I can again choose that I'm in the Icelandic locale or wherever else it is that I want to be. Let's also address indexing, and I don't think this is something you need to know about in great depth for the A+ exam, but just know at least what it is and where to configure it. What this basically is kind of a background cataloging of the files on your system, and it also includes things such as internet history. Now, what's the usefulness of this? This will help us to find files faster. Notice how, for example, when I go to, let me just go to a start menu, and notice that this is the start search item. If I were to start typing msconfig, or msinfo, excuse me, 32, then it would almost immediately show that to me up here. Why is that? Because it's already been indexed, and it didn't have to search the hard drive entirely for it. It's much faster to read this directly out of the index than it is to just scan the entire physical drive. This does affect performance in the short term. So you might have users that complain when you first install the current versions of Windows. They'll say, hey man, this thing's slow. I remember back when I had NT4, that was a lot faster. Well, that might be true in general, but it could also be indexing that's slowing it down, because in the early days of it, it'll index a lot more files. After the user has their index completely built, then it will only index new and changed items, so it's much faster thereafter. You can adjust these things in Control Panel. So if I go into Control Panel here, let me go right here, and if I were to go to, Control Panel, and then I would go to System and Maintenance, kind of doing this out of memory, and had a little hiccup there for a moment. Then I go to Indexing Options. Then we can see all the various settings. So, for example, there's my Internet Explorer history. What that might be useful for, by the way, is if I open up Internet Explorer, and I just go up here to the address bar, and I start to type something that's already been indexed, such as Windows. Notice that it's already got some of these favorited items, for example, indexed. So it can immediately take me to one of those places just by clicking on those types of items. That's the kind of thing that this can do for me. And then there's offline files. If I've offline filed an entire folder, my entire home folder, for example, that would make that very much faster. Start menu and any of the users that we have here as well. So that's where you would configure indexing. And again, overall, it's going to help your performance to be quite a bit faster when you're looking for something. And then finally, let's address one of my favorite features of Windows of all current editions. That would be Remote Desktop and also Remote Assistance. Remote Desktop allows me to access the desktop as if I were locally attached. This is what I actually do when I'm on the road. I mean, I might be, out in some other town somewhere, some other city. Like, for example, recently I was in Orlando doing a Tech Mentor conference. What I usually do is I'll sit on my laptop computer. There's my laptop computer with a little screen here, back in the hotel, and then over the internet, I will connect to my desktop computer, with a little monitor sticking out of it right here, back at home. I can do this using the remote desktop. And it's very useful because if I know the IP address, the public IP address here, I can adjust firewall settings and use some other things, such as free services on the internet that automatically update my public IP address here, so that I will then be able to connect from my laptop to my desktop, and I'll get the entire desktop that I would normally see on this screen, except that I'll get it over here on this screen. And I can do pretty much all productivity. The only thing that I probably can't do is high-end graphics games or something like that. But for simple graphics that don't have any animation in them, I can pretty much do that. Any text-based tasks that I need to do, using Word, checking email and Outlook, those sorts of things are pretty well transparent and almost exactly as the same as if I were seated locally at that workstation. Now, this is also known on a server level as terminal services. For example, for Windows 2000 and 2003, it was known as terminal services. It does pretty much the same thing, except that when we go over here, instead of connecting to a user desktop computer back in the office, this would be a 2003, a 2008 server instead. And instead of having just a single user across the internet, this could have dozens or even hundreds of users connected either through our own LAN on the same network here in our home network, or across wide area networks, or across the internet like this. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to have multiple users but a single point of administration, which can substantially reduce the amount of updates that I have to apply and so forth. Plus, I can use older hardware that might not be able to support an installation of current versions of Windows, but it is able to support launching the little client that's required to create this connection. It's very, very thin client that's needed there. So it doesn't really require any special resources, and yet I get all the benefits of running the most current version of Windows. I'm actually going to be running 2003 server, 2008 server if I'm using terminal services, but it can be configured to look exactly like a desktop operating system. And so that's one of the advantages here of remote desktop. For server 2008 R2, which is the most current release at this time, it's been renamed to Remote Desktop Services simply because that's really actually all it is remote desktop, just like I showed you, and just like I've been using, in fact. And I've showed you many times that I'm actually using this. This is actually remote desktop going on. The reality is I'm using this connection, but I'm connecting through, let me see if I can show you. I'm connecting through VMware. This is where the operating system's actually running, okay, right here. But in reality, I'm running it by remote desktop. And the reason why I do that is, instead of showing you directly in VMware, is because the recording software that I use seems to work better working in a remote desktop connection than it does through VMware. That's the only reason. You can also configure how you want the resources to be accessed. So, for example, if I open up the remote desktop connection here and bring it into this, this is actually an executable MSTSC, as you can see down here. And here I can choose various options with this. I can allow it to save credentials if I'm sure that someone else wouldn't also walk up to the same workstation and quite easily log on as my account. I can choose the display settings. I keep it small here for recording purposes, but I can change the color depth. You can see a lot of the different things that we have there. There's also a connection bar that would appear at the top of the screen if I decided to use that during full screen. That helps me to get a visual clue that I am indeed running remote desktop as opposed to a physical desktop. There's various local as opposed to remote resources. For example, I could use local printers. You know, I might be connecting to a computer that's halfway around the world. I don't want to use its printers when I print out a print job. I want to print out jobs that are, you know, right behind me on my desktop here. So I would choose local printers, for example, for something like that. And then you can also do things such as set up different programs to start up automatically. Maybe there's a little application that all the users that they connect to would only need to run a specific application. Well, I can make sure that that starts when they make their connection. And I can also identify what visual experience they actually have with this. If they have a high-speed connection, we can get most of all the best bells and whistles of Windows, but if we're connecting over a slow-speed modem, we probably only want to get the bare minimum, no fancy wallpaper, no font smoothing, no animations, any of that kind of stuff. So it just kind of depends upon the speed of your interface. And then with current versions of Windows, you can also use verification so that the destination computer that you're connecting with will identify whether or not it truly is who it says it is. This helps to prevent man-in-the-middle attacks where I'm trying to connect to another computer that I think is mine, but someone else has inserted a different computer of the same name in the middle, and instead I'm connecting to their computer and potentially giving up security secrets or something like this. So the emphasis on remote desktop is going to be on productivity. It's just that I need to get work done, and I need a desktop with which to get it complete. Okay, so I'm going to remote connect using remote desktop to, you know, my desktop in the office or a terminal server or a remote desktop services server. And then technically what this does is it uses a protocol known as Remote Desktop Protocol, which is kind of a multimedia protocol. It's useful for efficient display of, well, visual items. Okay, so that's what it's used for, and it uses TCP port 3389. So when you get more adept at using firewalls, if you're not already, then you'll have to be aware of the fact that you'll need to open up that port to allow people through, if you want to allow that. And then the executable, as I said earlier, is MSTSC. I guess I could just go to a command prompt here and demonstrate that to you as well here. MSTSC, press enter, and that will then pop open. Came on the other screen, but it'll pop open then, this remote desktop connection item. It's kind of trivia, but I would be aware of that. Sometimes CompTIA seems to be interested in little trivial matters like that. Also, you can enable remote desktop via the system properties. So if we go back again to our desktop here, we can identify that we were able to configure this item through the system properties. And if I go over here and click change settings here in any of this, or if I go to advanced system settings or remote settings, they really all take me to the same place. It's just whichever tab it starts with. Here, if I chose the remote settings, it takes us right to the remote tab. Notice that there's a remote assistance thing that I can allow here as well. That'll come important in a moment here when we talk about that. And then I can also specify whether I don't want to allow connections from any computer running any version of remote desktop. This is less secure because there's no way to identify that we truly are who we say we are. So that's the man-in-the-middle attack I was telling you about earlier, or impersonation attack. There's also allow connections only from computers running a remote desktop with network level authentication. This is more secure because it will confirm that you really are who I think you are on making the connection. And then you need to select the users. The logged on user that's an administrative account, which is the trainer, already has access at all times. But I can click add and choose other users as I please. And then by comparison, we also have something called remote assistance. It uses the same technology, the RDP protocol, TCP 3389. Also the same concept. You get to see the desktop, although you may or may not be able to control it and use the keyboard or mouse with it, depending upon the level of permission. With this, the emphasis is not on productivity, it's more on support. So I might be trying to explain something to a user, and it might be involving a complex set of steps. And I'm thinking to myself, gee, it would be so much easier if I could just show this person what to do. On the other hand, the user might be calling me, and they're saying, hey, I'm confused. I see a green thing right above a red thing, and there's this yellow thing down in the lower left, and when I click it and drag it, it doesn't do anything. Okay, what? It might be easier if I could actually see them and see what they're trying to do, because they don't have the same technology and terminology that you and I are accustomed to. So rather than yelling at them for not being too bright, instead I could say, hey, let's just do a remote assistance instead. No, I would never say that they're not too bright. I might think that, but I would never say that out loud. Okay, so what goes on with this is the user must send out a secure invitation. Now this, in and of itself, could be a technical support issue. They may not be adept enough to be able to even send an invitation. There are certain corporations that do have this kind of thing built into, for example, a company intranet. So if they click on the help and support link in the company intranet, then it will say, ask for remote desktop assistance, and they can click it, and then it'll step them through all the steps that they need to do. But somebody has to customize that in the corporation. But let's go ahead and take a look at how this might work here as well. So by way of example, maybe I get a help desk call from a user that's working with this highly complex application, and they just can't seem to figure it out. So they call the help desk and they say, hey, can you help me with solitaire? I just can't figure out what my next move should be. And you reply, of course, with the statement that, I'm sorry, this helpline is only for people that have legitimate company business. And they'll tell you, well, I was supposed to be in a meeting 30 minutes ago that they can't start without me. But I just don't feel like I can go in there until I at least figure out my next move. Now, by the way, for those of you that can figure out what the next move should be here, if you'll raise your hand within the next 10 seconds, I'll send you a free Lamborghini sports car. I just saw one today. It was sweet. Any takers? All right, looks like time's running out, so I guess we don't have any takers on that one. I'm sorry, there's no more time for that particular prize. We'll try again some other time. So anyway, they can't figure out this next move, and instead of going through the whole thing with them, maybe I'll just tell them, hey, look, just click on Start, go to Help and Support, then I want you to go to Invite a Friend to connect your computer. Today I'm your friend, so click it. And then invite someone to help you. Click that. And then they can send the invitation over instant messaging methods, Outlook Express, or Outlook, or they can choose invitation as a file, and they'll just save that as a file. And then here, notice that they can specify how long the invitation is good for and what that user's name is, and then they'll just click Continue. Here they should require a password, so they'll enter in a password which allows this person to make the connection. Okay, so I'm typing in a highly complex password there, of course. And then we'll save the invitation, and we need to choose a file location to which we want to save it. I'm just saving it on a share, but we'll just save it wherever both users would be able to then access that particular item. Now, from the administrator or the help desk person's side of the transaction, they're going to find the file that the user created through the invitation. They double-click on it, and then what happens is they'll be prompted for this password, which will then enter in. Now, of course, Microsoft masks passwords because that's more secure. That way, people looking over your shoulder don't find out what these secret passwords are. So I'm going to enter that in right here. Well, wait a minute. That doesn't look right. Hey, you can actually see what I'm typing, can't you? Well, shame on you people for looking. You knew I was going to type a password in, and yet you still looked at the screen. Shame on you. Actually, shame on Microsoft. Why didn't they mask this? I don't know. They should have. Anyway, I'm going to go off here to the side here. I'm going to actually enter in the real password. And then once I've done that, it's going to start to launch the Windows Remote Assistance window. And then from the help desk person's side of the transaction, what they'll do is they'll find the file that the user saved, and I'll double-click on this. And it's going to prompt me for a password here in a moment. Oh, by the way, before I get too much further along there, look at this. This is kind of potentially security sensitive because the user did come up with a password here, but what if someone could open this in Notepad and actually see the password in Notepad? You think that could happen? Actually not. You see, what happens is it encrypts this password here so that it's not easily decipherable, and that's actually reasonable level of security. All right, so they double click on that, and of course Microsoft being security sensitive, they do not allow that to be plainly visible. And when I get this interface, which is what the help desk person is going to see, they'll type that password in too, and of course Microsoft would mask this password so that someone looking over my shoulder can't see the password. See, so you know. Hey, wait a minute. That doesn't look right. Oh, it's showing up in plain text. Oh, and you were looking the whole time, weren't you? You mean you didn't bother to look away from the screen when you knew I was going to type in a password? Why, shame on you. Actually, shame on Microsoft. Why in the world didn't they bother to mask this? And this is in Windows 7 that I'm typing this right now. So in various generations of Windows, they still have not come up with this properly. So it's a little bit of a shame on Microsoft for that, in my opinion. And then what would happen is the person at the help desk would actually see the screen. Actually, it looks like I chose game and deal here again, so maybe I gave up on that last one. It was just too hard. Anyway, so now what can happen is we can actually interoperate with the interface here, and we can start to drag cards around, as you can see here, and get, you know, different exposures here. Oh, hey, give me just a minute here. I may never actually get to that meeting. Anyway, so you can get the idea here. Now, in order for me to get access to this, the user will see a prompt on their screen that they have to click OK upon that allows me to also be able to interoperate with it. Otherwise, the help desk person will only be able to view the desktop. And notice that we can also have a chat session that we will open up as well. In this nugget, we took a look at Windows tools and diagnostics. This was part 2, where we started off by taking a look at the MMC console. Remember, this is something that we already have in a lot of ways in computer management, but you can also customize this and save it for your own preferences. We also took a look at Task Manager, which is a great way to look at what's going on in the system currently to see the various applications, services, users, and to be able to terminate things as well. We looked at Regedit, which is the tool that's used to get kind of deep inside of Windows, especially for changing things that might not otherwise be easily accessed through the interface, like Control Panel and the like. And we looked also at regional settings. This is something that we can do to change things like, oh, the currency that's displayed, the language, whether or not you want to use 24-hour time, that sort of thing. We looked also at indexing. This is a way where the system is going to perform faster when the user searches for something, although it might be slower while it's building the index right at the beginning. And then we concluded with the discussion of remote desktop and remote assistance. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.